So our next session will be chaired by Dr. Ravanthi Kanagra, and I'll call on her to introduce the speakers.
Thanks, Amiji. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another fully loaded session of talks by our international speakers. I'm directly moving on to our next talk. Professor Geoff Head from the Baker Head Heart and Diabetes Institute. Please, can you share your first slide, Prof? He's going to talk to us about masked hypertension and white coat hypertension.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation for talking today. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, all good.
Okay, so as James mentioned, there are at least three ways to, or three places to measure blood pressure: in the clinic, at home, and ambulatory. And there are different methods used: manual auscultation, semi-manual oscillometric, and also automated oscillometric in the clinic. And in the home, it is semi-manual. And of course, ambulatory blood pressure is automated over 24 hours. Now, we know from the guidelines that there's a fair degree of unanimity on the thresholds for hypertension, both in the clinic, at home. 24-hour night and day values are very similar across a number of different societies of hypertension, including Australia. And I'll have to add ISH here, but I don't think they differ too much from this. Now, the three methods or three places to measure don't measure really the same thing. They all are used for diagnosis of hypertension and evaluation of antihypertensive therapy and prediction of cardiovascular events. But white coat and masked hypertension, you really need to have ambulatory blood pressure, and you can do it also with home measurement, but it's not quite as accurate as using the gold standard ambulatory blood pressure monitoring for determining white coat and masked hypertension. And we know that ambulatory blood pressure monitoring is the gold standard for blood pressure assessment. It measures blood pressure every 15 to 30 minutes over 24 hours, giving somewhere between 40 and 60 readings, measures 24-hour daytime awake, nighttime asleep, systolic, diastolic blood pressure, and also heart rate. And you can see a sample trace here. Now, white coat hypertension is also known as isolated office hypertension, is defined by elevated blood pressure in the office with low ambulatory or normotensive ambulatory or home blood pressure. Traditionally, this definition relates to those not on therapy, and the precise definition is shown here with systolic greater than or equal to 140 over 90 with 24-hour blood pressure less than 130 on 80 and awake and asleep blood pressure below these thresholds. So it's quite hard to meet all of those diagnoses. It's recommended by the ESH that the diagnosis should require confirmation by repeated ambulatory or home blood pressure monitoring, and that the ambulatory blood pressure values that may be attained in the office during the first or last 24 hours may also partly reflect white coat hypertension. This is a study by Gurin some years ago, actually, which measured the differences from automated blood pressure to nurse blood pressure to physician, and found that compared to automated device, nurses were 8 millimeters systolic and the same diastolic higher than automated, but physicians were 17 over 4 millimeters higher compared to the automated device, and 9 millimeters over 4 millimeters compared to the nurse. So what causes isolated office hypertension or white coat hypertension? Well, it's generally thought to be due to anxiety, where once entering the office of the physician, there is an arousal stimulus which causes blood pressure to rise. And this is a study from Gianfranco Parati in 1998 that showed that before the visit, blood pressure is around about 130 systolic. It goes up over 150 during the visit and comes down after the visit. And heart rate, you can see it's very much an alerting response. and they calculated the difference between clinic blood pressure versus ambulatory blood pressure, which is showing about a 10 millimeter difference here. But it's the white coat effect, which is the arousal of going into the doctor's office and having your blood pressure measured, is actually much greater. So white coat effect is not simply the difference between the clinic and the ambulatory measurements. It is due to a marked arousal stimulus. And one of the reasons why this difference is less than the arousal is that ABPM, or ambulatory blood pressure, also reflects daily life and also involves stress. So it's not a totally relaxed situation, but it is a very good way of working out what people's blood pressure is. Martin Myers in 1997 compared automated and physician blood pressures in the office and found a slightly different result in that self-measurement of blood pressure by the patient in the office setting does not reduce the magnitude of the white coat effect. So it's not necessarily the physician as such, but it is also related to the situation of being in the office. Pickering in 2002 summarised why the white coat, or where the white coat effect is greatest. It's suggested that it's higher in those with higher clinic pressures, those when taken by physician rather than nurse, and that's a fairly common finding. When taken by a senior rather than a junior physician, it's also thought to be higher in women than men, and in older than in younger subjects. We published a paper with Martin Myers on the using automated office blood pressure to minimise white coat effect in 2012, and we found that automated office blood pressure is quite similar to awake, ambulatory and home blood pressures. So it wasn't strongly pushed by the Canadian Society of Hypertension to use automated office blood pressure. But automated office blood pressure, and this is a figure from James Sharman's group, which I think is really fascinating, because it shows that if you repeat every minute an automated office blood pressure, the values you get go down over time, both for systolic and diastolic. And this is the automated average, and this is the daytime ambulatory blood pressure. And this is why it's recommended to use the second and third reading. But what it really tells you is that the blood pressure is not stable if you keep repeating it. There is a reduction over time. So it perhaps is a little bit arbitrary that you measure these blood pressure in this way. But as James mentioned, you really do have to follow a very standardized procedure in order to get validated responses. Now we turn to masked hypertension, which is where the blood pressure is normal or normotensive in the office or below threshold, but at home it's above threshold and considered hypertension. So these are usually not on therapy, and it's the systolic blood pressure less than 140 and less than 90 millimeters of mercury, whereas the mean 24-hour blood pressure is greater than 130 on 80 and or awake 135 on 85 and sleep greater than 120 on 70. And it should be confirmed by repeating the ambulatory or home blood pressure monitoring, and also that isolated nocturnal hypertension can be considered as a form of masked hypertension, because that cannot be determined in the office. Masked uncontrolled hypertension is identical definition as above, but it's for those on therapy. So it's not really masked hypertension because the doctor knows that the patient's on hypertension because they're on therapy and considered hypertension, but it's not controlled. Masked hypertension can be caused by stress of work or family situations, not taking medication unless they're going to the doctor. So there's refraining from alcohol when going to see the doctor is another factor that can cause blood pressure in the doctor's office or physician's office to be relatively normal, but not at home. there is a lot of misdiagnosis with manual blood pressure versus automatic, and I just wanted to point this study out from Edwards in 2013, where they looked at white coat effect and white coat effect with incorrect assessment. And with manual office, white coat effect was 32%, but with automated office, it was only 19%. And masked effect was in manual was only 16%, whereas if you use an automated device, you get 37%. So what happens is that manual overestimates white coat effect and underestimates masked hypertension. So you really just, depending on which one you swap between the two. And this is because white coat hypertensive and masked hypertensives are really close to the threshold. And I'd just like to point out a little bit about comparing home and ambulatory blood pressure. While home is more convenient and cheaper, that it doesn't have the same sensitivity as compared to ambulatory blood pressure. So it has low sensitivity but high specificity for detecting white coat, masked hypertension and sustained hypertension. Thus, over half white coat hypertensives are not detected with home blood pressure monitoring. But that's assuming that the ambulatory blood pressure is accurate. We did a rather large study in 2008 with Anastasia and Karen and 11 centres from all states with 8,500 to find the reference ambulatory equivalents for hypertension. But we also compared nurse measured and doctor measured in this study, and found that when the nurse measured blood pressure, white coat hypertension was just close to 8%. When the doctor measured it, it was 19%. Masked hypertension, 24% with nurse and 11% with doctor. And you can see the total of these two really just add up. And in fact, I think the highest interest of our article was the staff to the doctor difference in the method of measurement. I'd just like to now mention the OSDIAB study, which was the first population-based sample with ambulatory blood pressure, which was the phase 3 follow-up of the OSDIAB study that started in around about 2000. And we had 508, 237 males and 271 females, and the males were a little bit older, and they had higher office blood pressure and higher, very slightly, diastolic pressure. So of those cohort, we found that 43% who have hypertension, 21% of the total group have masked hypertension, and only 3% have white coat hypertension. So this was, in Australia, was rather low than we thought. 25% taking antihypertensive and 9% taking therapy still have hypertension. And this was mainly males, and 17 are untreated with hypertension. So I looked again at the masked hypertension prevalence and white coat hypertension. As I said, it's 21% and 3%. And there really wasn't any difference between males and females with the prevalence of masked and white coat hypertension, nor did we see any differences whether it was measured in the city or in regional Australia. So despite the low level of white coat hypertension, we did see an overall misdiagnosis level of around about 24%, which is rather hard. The last thing I'd like to mention is the cardiovascular risk of having masked or white coat hypertension. It's not the same as normotension. And there's this very large study from IDACO, which is the International Database of Home Blood Pressure in Relation to Cardiovascular Outcomes study, led by George Sturgio. And this is the numbers with 14% with white coat and 8% with masked hypertension and 18% with sustained hypertension. And this graph shows the percentage of events over 12 years for normotension, white coat, masked hypertension and hypertension. And you might think, well, white coat hypertension isn't benign. Masked hypertension is not, certainly not benign and compared to hypertension. But if you actually plot the home systolic blood pressure with the events, you'll see it's very strong relationship with a correlation of 0.99. So it's not so much classifying people into different groups of hypertension. It's simply what is your out of office measurement which is what's predicting events. And it's the masked and white coat hypertensives which are sitting around the threshold and either a normal in the office or abnormal in the office and different at home that is causing this classification. But really, one needs to concentrate on blood pressure. So my take-home message for this really is that white coat and masked hypertension should not exist. This is a bit radical because there's hundreds and hundreds of papers on white coat and masked hypertension, but really hypertension diagnosis should be made by ambulatory blood pressure monitoring, or if not possible, home blood pressure monitoring. And I take Alta's point about the availability of this in less resourced countries. It poses a problem. But clinic blood pressure really should be used as a screening tool. And as we know, the main barrier to using ambulatory blood pressure is cost. And I'm very pleased that a group of members of the High Blood Pressure Council, including Anastasia, Michael and Marcus and myself, got together and made an application to the government to have ambulatory blood pressure Medicare rebated. And we've just recently, a few weeks ago, had the Medical Services Advisory Committee recommend funding, and we're now waiting on the approval by the Minister. So I think things should change. We should be able to get better accurate blood pressure in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Well, I don't see any questions at this point of time, so I'll start by asking my own question. Prof, how close is the GAD questionnaire in predicting or picking up a white coat hypertension?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
How effectively does the GAD questionnaire, General Anxiety Disorder 7 questionnaire, picks up the white coat hypertension?
I have no idea actually about that. Clearly, anxiety and stress in the office situation when you're having your blood pressure measured can push people over the threshold. It really depends what their overall pressure is, because daily life also does the same thing. There's a lot of stressful events that can make your blood pressure go up. Certainly, it's an indication of arousal. I've estimated from our very large study of 8,500 that there is a white coat effect in about 40% of people. So nearly half people have a measurable response to stress, that's important. But we also know that eventually white coat hypertensives go on to become full-blown hypertensive, because as they age, their pressure goes up, and that brings them over the threshold.
Okay, thank you, Prof. We have a question from Avinash here, and he's asking that, does the decrease in blood pressure with subsequent automated blood pressure measurements have anything to do with the constant cuff inflation?
Well, obviously, with repeated cuff inflation every minute, you would get a degree of acclimatization to the phenomenon, and probably James is best to comment on what he thinks is the cause. But this is not unique to that study. It's been found by others, and white coat hypertensives show the same reduction, in fact a parallel reduction in blood pressure over time. So exactly the mechanism, I think one would have to investigate that scientifically.
All right. For the benefit of time, I will forward the other questions to the council, and we'll get the answers soon from Professor Geoff. Thanks, Prof. That was a spot on timing. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.